The cold winter night wrapped around the quiet streets of Pine Grove, an upscale neighborhood where large houses sat behind perfectly trimmed hedges. It was almost 11:30 p.m. when James Thompson's dark blue Toyota Camry moved slowly through the area. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he carefully followed the speed limit, knowing that in this wealthy white neighborhood, his presence might draw unwanted attention. The red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror just as he had expected they would. James took a deep breath and pulled over to the side of the road, right under a bright street lamp. He had chosen this spot on purpose. Good lighting meant everything would be visible. His heart beat faster, but his face remained calm as he watched two white police officers step out of their patrol car. Officer Ryan Collins, a young cop with just 3 years on the force, approached the driver's side while his partner, Mike Brennan, a stockier veteran officer, walked toward the passenger window. Their hands rested near their weapons, a detail James noticed immediately. "License and registration, please," Officer Collins said, shining his flashlight into the car. The beam moved across James's face, then down to his hands, which were still on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" James's voice was steady and polite. He spoke clearly, using proper English, which seemed to surprise the young officer slightly. "We've had several reports of suspicious activity in this area," Collins replied, his tone becoming a bit less stern. "Your vehicle was moving unusually slowly." "I see," James said. "I was being careful to observe the speed limit." He moved his right hand slowly toward his jacket pocket. "I'm going to reach for my wallet now, if that's all right." Officer Brennan's flashlight beam joined his partner's, both lights focusing on James's movements. James could feel the tension in the air as he carefully pulled out his wallet. But instead of immediately showing his ID, he placed the wallet on the dashboard. "Sir, I asked for your license and registration," Collins said, his voice taking on an edge of frustration. James nodded. "Before I provide those, I'd like to know if your body cameras are active, officers." The two policemen exchanged glances. This wasn't a typical response from a driver during a routine traffic stop. "Our cameras are always on during stops, sir," Brennan spoke up from the passenger side. "Now, please provide your identification." James reached for the wallet again, opened it slowly, but paused. "Officers, I want to be fully transparent. I'm going to explain something that might seem unusual, but I ask for your patience." Collins's hand moved closer to his weapon. "Sir, stop stalling and show us your ID. Now." "I understand your concern," James continued calmly, "but I'm currently involved in a situation that requires discretion. I can prove my identity, but I'd prefer to do so at the station if necessary." This response set off immediate red flags for both officers. Collins stepped back slightly, adopting a more defensive stance. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." James didn't argue. With deliberate movements, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door slowly. He was dressed well in a dark sweater and dress pants, his shoes polished and expensive, details that didn't match the officer's initial assumptions about him. As he stood up, James' impressive height became apparent. He stood at least 6 feet tall, his posture straight and dignified. Despite the tense situation, he maintained an air of calm authority that seemed to confuse the officers even more. "Place your hands on the hood of the car, sir," Collins ordered, while Brennan moved around to provide backup. James complied, but spoke again. "Officers, I want to be clear that I'm cooperating fully. However, I need to maintain certain confidentiality at this time. I'm not refusing to identify myself. I'm simply requesting to do so through proper channels." His unusual composure and articulate speech created a strange atmosphere. The officers had dealt with all types of people: belligerent drunks, scared teenagers, angry businessmen, but James's behavior didn't fit any familiar pattern. "We've had burglaries reported in this area," Brennan said gruffly while Collins began a pat-down. "And you're acting very suspicious, sir." "I understand how this appears," James replied. "And I respect that you're doing your job. I simply ask that you respect that I have my reasons for discretion." The officers found no weapons, but they did find an expensive phone and what appeared to be some kind of government-issued ID card in his pocket, one that James quickly but politely refused to let them examine. That was the final straw for the officers. "Turn around," Collins ordered. You're under arrest for obstruction and suspicious activity. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, James showed no resistance or anger. Instead, a slight smile crossed his face, as if everything was going exactly as he had expected. The back of the police car was cold, but James Thompson sat there as comfortably as if he were in a luxury vehicle. Officers Collins and Brennan kept looking at him through the rearview mirror, puzzled by their unusual prisoner. Most people they arrested were either angry or scared. James was neither. "Run the car's registration again," Collins told Brennan as they drove toward the station. The car had come back registered to a Marshall Industries, a company they couldn't find much information about. "Something's not right about this guy," Brennan muttered, typing on the patrol car's computer. "He's too calm. And did you see his shoes? Those are $1,000 dress shoes." In the back seat, James could hear their conversation but kept his eyes focused on the passing streets. He noticed they were taking the long route to the station, probably hoping dispatch would come back with more information before they arrived. The radio crackled. "Unit 247, be advised. The vehicle's registration is connected to a private corporate account. No further details available without a warrant." This news made both officers even more suspicious. Collins adjusted his mirror to look at James again. "Sir, this would all go a lot easier if you just tell us who you are." "I appreciate your concern, officer," James replied politely. "But as I mentioned, there are procedures that need to be followed. I'm happy to go to the station." Brennan turned around in his seat. "Look, man, if you're some kind of undercover Fed or something, just tell us. We're all on the same side here." James simply smiled. "I understand your frustration. Please, let's continue to the station." The response made Brennan's face turn red with annoyance. He faced forward again, shaking his head. "Collins, call the sergeant. This isn't normal." When they arrived at the police station, 3 more patrol cars were waiting in the parking lot. Word had spread quickly about the mysterious well-dressed black man who wouldn't identify himself. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez stood at the entrance, her arms crossed. As Collins and Brennan led James into the station, Rodriguez studied him carefully. Unlike her officers, she noticed things they had missed: the perfect posture, the way he scanned every room he entered, how he seemed to be observing everything and everyone. "I'm Sergeant Rodriguez," she said as James was led to the booking area. "Would you like to tell me what's going on here?" "Sergeant," James nodded respectfully. "I apologize for any confusion. I'm happy to cooperate with booking procedures, but I need to make one phone call first. After that, everything will become clear." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Most suspects demanded their phone calls. They didn't politely request them. "Process him first," she ordered her officers. "Then he can make his call." The booking process was strange for everyone involved. James's fingerprints were taken, but when they ran through the system, the results were instantly blocked by some kind of security clearance. His belongings were expensive, but gave no clues to his identity. Just the high-end phone, a nice wallet with no ID, and that mysterious government-style card that seemed to have some kind of electronic chip in it. "Empty your pockets completely," Collins ordered, still frustrated by the whole situation. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a single business card. He handed it to Sergeant Rodriguez. "This is the number I'll need to call." Rodriguez looked at the plain white card. It had only a phone number, no name, no agency, nothing else. The number started with a Washington, D.C. area code. Book him for obstruction and resisting identification, she decided, pocketing the card. "We'll sort this out after he's processed." As officers led James to a holding cell, he remained as calm as ever. "Sergeant," he called back, "that phone call will need to be made within the next 30 minutes. After that, things might become more complicated." Something in his tone made Rodriguez pause. She'd been a cop for 18 years, and her instincts were telling her this was no ordinary arrest. "Collins, Brennan," she called to her officers. "In my office now. I want to hear every detail about this traffic stop again." As James was led away, they could have sworn they saw him check his watch and nod, as if everything was running right on schedule. Sergeant Rodriguez sat in her office, staring at the mysterious business card with the DC phone number. Through her window, she could see James Thompson sitting calmly in the holding cell, his hands folded in his lap like he was waiting for a business meeting rather than facing criminal charges. Run through it one more time, she told Officers Collins and Brennan, who shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The more they explained the traffic stop, the more they felt like they might have walked into something bigger than they realized. "Ma'am," Officer Collins said, "I think we should make that phone call. Something about this doesn't feel right." Before Rodriguez could answer, the station's night desk officer knocked on her door. "Sergeant, you need to see this." He handed her a fax that had just come in. As she read it, her eyes widened. "Get the captain on the phone," she ordered. "Now." Meanwhile, in the holding cell, James noticed the sudden increase in activity. Officers were walking faster, speaking in hushed tones, and keeping their distance from his cell. He smiled slightly, knowing his carefully planned timeline was unfolding exactly as intended. A young officer approached his cell. "Sir, would you like to make your phone call now?" James stood up smoothly. "Actually," he said, checking his watch, "that won't be necessary anymore. In about 2 minutes, your captain should be walking through that door." The officer looked confused, but just then, Captain William Hayes burst into the station. His face was red, and he was still wearing a golf shirt, clearly called in from home. He walked straight to James's cell. "Open it," he ordered. The young officer scrambled to unlock the cell door. "Captain Hayes," James said pleasantly, as if greeting an old friend. "I'd apologize for the late-night disturbance." "Would someone please tell me what's going on?" Sergeant Rodriguez demanded, walking up with Collins and Brennan behind her. Before anyone could answer, the station's front doors opened again. This time, a tall woman in a sharp suit walked in, followed by 2 men in dark suits and earpieces. She walked directly to the group, her heels clicking on the floor. "I'm Sarah Martinez, Chief of Staff for the Police Commissioner's Office," she announced, then turned to James. "Sir, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Sarah," James replied, straightening his jacket as he stepped out of the cell. Everything went exactly as expected. Captain Hayes looked like he might faint. "Officers Collins and Brennan," he said weakly, "you just arrested Dr. James Thompson Marshall, the new police commissioner from D.C. The silence in the station was deafening. Collins and Brennan stood frozen, their faces pale. Sergeant Rodriguez closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Actually," James said, his voice now carrying unmistakable authority, "they did exactly what I wanted them to do." He turned to face the officers. 3 weeks ago, my office received multiple complaints about racial profiling during traffic stops in this district. Instead of launching a formal investigation, I decided to see for myself. Sarah Martinez stepped forward, opening her briefcase. "We've been monitoring the whole operation. Dr. Thompson Marshall's car was equipped with multiple cameras, and his phone recorded everything. But the registration, the company name," Brennan stammered. "Marshall Industries is my private consulting firm," James explained. "And that government ID you weren't allowed to see. My police commissioner's badge. Everything about tonight was designed to test how your department handles a situation with a black suspect who doesn't immediately submit to profiling." Captain Hayes wiped sweat from his forehead. "Dr. Thompson Marshall, I assure you." "Captain," James interrupted firmly but not unkindly, "save your explanations for tomorrow's meeting. I'll be at the station at 9 a.m. sharp. We have a lot to discuss about reform." He turned to Collins and Brennan, who looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. "Officers, you'll both be there too. Tonight was a teaching moment, not a punishment. The real work begins tomorrow." As James walked out of the station with his staff, he stopped at the door. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he called back. "Good instincts on wanting to make that phone call. You've earned yourself a spot in tomorrow's meeting, too." The officers watched in stunned silence as their mysterious prisoner drove away in a black SUV, leaving them to wonder how a routine traffic stop had turned into what would surely become the most talked-about night of their careers. The next morning, Pine Grove Police Station buzzed with nervous energy. Officers Collins and Brennan arrived an hour early, their uniforms pressed perfectly, shoes shined to mirror finish. They sat in the break room, barely touching their coffee. "My wife couldn't stop laughing when I told her," Brennan said, shaking his head. "She said it serves me right for being so quick to judge." Collins stared into his coffee cup. "Do you think we'll lose our badges over this?" Before Brennan could answer, Sergeant Rodriguez walked in. She'd clearly gotten little sleep, but her uniform was crisp and her expression determined. "Both of you, in the conference room. Now." They'd followed her into the department's largest meeting room, where Captain Hayes was already setting up a projector. His hands shook slightly as he connected cables to his laptop. "The commissioner's office sent over some files this morning," Rodriguez told them, placing thick folders in front of each officer. "Read them before he arrives." The officers opened their folders and found detailed reports about traffic stops in their district over the past 6 months. The statistics painted an uncomfortable picture. Black drivers were being pulled over at 3 times the rate of white drivers in the same areas. "I don't understand," Collins said, flipping through the pages. "We were just doing our jobs, following protocol." The station's front desk officer appeared at the door. "They're here." Dr. Thompson Marshall walked in, but he looked very different from the man they'd arrested last night. He wore an impeccably tailored dark blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a gold police commissioner's badge pinned to his lapel. Sarah Martinez and 3 other staff members followed him, carrying laptops and files. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying the same calm authority they remembered from the night before. "I trust everyone has had time to review the preliminary data." Captain Hayes stood up quickly. "Yes, sir. Dr. Thompson Marshall, about last night." "Please." James held up his hand. "Before we discuss last night's events, I want to show you something." He nodded to Sarah, who connected her laptop to the projector. The screen lit up with video footage from James's car the previous night. The officers watched themselves approach the vehicle, their hands near their weapons. The footage had been enhanced with data, response times, behavioral analysis, and protocol violations highlighted in real time. In the past year, James began, 17 complaints of racial profiling have been filed against this precinct. All were dismissed due to lack of evidence. He paused the video. "That changes today." Collins raised his hand hesitantly, like a student in class. "Sir, with all due respect, you are acting suspicious. Any officer would have." "Would they?" James interrupted softly. He clicked to another video, showing the same officers pulling over a white driver the week before. Their approach was noticeably different. More relaxed, hands away from weapons, friendly conversation from the start. The room fell silent. Brennan looked down at his hands, while Collins's face flushed red. "I'm not here to shame anyone," James said, his tone gentler now. "I'm here because this precinct has the potential to become a model for change. That's why I chose it for my first undercover operation as commissioner." Sarah distributed more folders. "This is our new training program. Over the next 6 months, every officer in this precinct will participate in bias recognition and community engagement workshops." "Sir," Sergeant Rodriguez spoke up. "Why did you let us arrest you? You could have shown your ID at any time." James smiled. "Because real change doesn't come from reading reports or watching training videos. It comes from experience. Last night, every officer in this room experienced what countless citizens go through, the confusion of dealing with a situation that challenges their assumptions." He walked to the window, looking out at the morning traffic. "Officers Collins and Brennan, your body camera footage will be part of our new training program. Not as an example of bad policing, but as a teaching tool about how unconscious bias affects split-second decisions." Captain Hayes cleared his throat. "And the media? This could look very bad for the department." "The media won't hear about this from my office," James assured him. "This isn't about public shaming. It's about meaningful change. Starting today, this precinct begins a new chapter. The question is, are you all ready to be part of it?" The officers exchanged looks, the weight of the moment sinking in. Their routine traffic stop hadn't just caught a suspicious driver, it had caught them in the middle of a revolution in policing. The county courthouse buzzed with unusual activity 3 days after James Thompson Marshall's arrest. Officers Collins and Brennan sat nervously on a wooden bench outside Courtroom 3, both in their dress uniforms. They had been ordered to appear for what they thought would be a formal hearing about the traffic stop incident. "Something's not right," Brennan whispered to his partner. "Have you noticed all the important people showing up?" Collins nodded. He had been watching a steady stream of well-dressed individuals entering the courthouse. City council members, high-ranking police officials, and even news reporters gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Sergeant Rodriguez walked up to her officers, her face serious. The hearing starts in 20 minutes. Remember what we discussed. Just tell the truth about everything that happened that night." Inside the courtroom, Judge Eleanor Martinez, known for her strict demeanor and no-nonsense approach, was already at her bench, reviewing papers. She kept looking at her phone, as if waiting for an important message. Sarah Martinez, James's chief of staff, moved efficiently through the crowded courthouse hallways, directing people to specific seats. She had arranged the courtroom like a theater, making sure everyone would have the perfect view of what was about to unfold. "Places, everyone," she called out softly, checking her tablet. "We're about to begin." The courtroom doors opened, and people filed in according to Sarah's careful plan. In the front row sat the mayor and police chief. Behind them were community leaders and civil rights activists. The press was restricted to the back rows, their phones and cameras strictly prohibited. Officers Collins and Brennan were led to seats near the front, directly facing the judge's bench. They noticed their captain and several other high-ranking officers sitting in a specially designated area to their right. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Martinez officially opened the session. "Before we begin," the judge announced, her voice carrying through the now-packed courtroom, "I want to make it clear that this is not a typical hearing. What happens in this courtroom today will set a precedent for law enforcement practices across our state." The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened again. James Thompson Marshall walked in, but not wearing the suit everyone expected. Instead, he wore the same sweater and pants from the night of his arrest. The room fell silent as he walked to the front. "Dr. Thompson Marshall," Judge Martinez said, a hint of respect in her voice, "are you ready to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," James replied. "But first, I'd like to thank everyone for participating in what might be the most important police training exercise this city has ever seen." A murmur ran through the crowd. Collins and Brennan looked at each other in confusion. "Training exercise?" Judge Martinez raised her hand for silence. "Let the record show that this court has been convened not for a criminal hearing, but as part of an authorized law enforcement training program developed by Police Commissioner Dr. James Thompson Marshall." Sarah Martinez stood up, addressing the court. 3 days ago, Officers Collins and Brennan participated unknowingly in a carefully orchestrated scenario designed to expose unconscious bias in police procedures. Today, we will analyze that scenario step by step, with input from legal experts, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement professionals. The officers watched in amazement as their body camera footage appeared on large screens around the courtroom. James walked to the center of the room, now every inch the distinguished police commissioner they had come to know. What these officers didn't know, he continued, was that their traffic stop was being monitored by multiple agencies. Every decision, every word, every action was recorded and analyzed. Not to punish, but to learn. Judge Martinez leaned forward. "Dr. Thompson Marshall, you placed yourself in considerable risk with this operation. Was it necessary to go to such lengths?" James looked directly at Collins and Brennan. "Your Honor, real change requires real experience. Today, we're not here to point fingers or assign blame. We're here to understand how deep-rooted biases affect law enforcement, and more importantly, how we can work together to overcome them." The courtroom remained silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. What had started as a simple traffic stop was about to become a landmark case study in police reform, with Officers Collins and Brennan's routine patrol at the center of it all. The courtroom screens flickered with footage from the night of the arrest. Everyone watched as multiple camera angles showed James's car being pulled over, the officers approaching, and the entire interaction that followed. But this time, the footage included something new: thermal imaging and heart rate data from both the officers and James himself. "What you're seeing," James explained, standing in the center of the courtroom, "is fear. Not just from me, but from Officers Collins and Brennan as well. Fear that comes from assumptions we make about each other before a single word is spoken." Sarah Martinez stepped forward with a laser pointer, highlighting the data on the screen. "Notice the officers' elevated heart rates the moment they saw Dr. Thompson Marshall was black. Their hands moved closer to their weapons, even though there were no signs of threat." Collins shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but James raised his hand. "Officers, please don't feel singled out. Your reactions were typical. That's exactly why we're here." Judge Martinez leaned forward. Dr. Thompson Marshall, please explain to the court your full role and purpose in this operation. James nodded and straightened his tie. 3 months ago, I was appointed as the new police commissioner for the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. But before accepting the position, I made a condition. I wanted to conduct a series of undercover operations across different cities, experiencing firsthand how officers interact with minority civilians. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The mayor shifted in his seat, and the police chief's face turned red. Your Honor, James continued, I hold a Ph.D. in criminal justice and psychology. I've spent 20 years studying police community relations, but all the research in the world can't compare to lived experience. That's why I put myself in that car that night. He walked closer to Officers Collins and Brennan. These officers didn't do anything that would be considered officially wrong under current protocols, and that's exactly the problem we need to address. The screens changed to show a split-screen comparison. James's traffic stop next to stops of white drivers from the same week. The differences were stark and undeniable. In white driver interactions, James pointed out, officers approached casually, hands relaxed, tone friendly. They accepted unusual responses with patience. But with me, a well-dressed black man in an expensive car, the assumption of danger was immediate and automatic. Sarah distributed thick packets to everyone in the courtroom. These are the results of similar tests conducted in 12 other cities. The pattern is consistent, regardless of department size or location. Judge Martinez studied her copy carefully. And what do you propose as a solution, Commissioner? James smiled for the first time since entering the courtroom. That's why we're all here today. This courtroom has been converted into a training center. For the next 8 hours, we're going to analyze every second of that traffic stop, with input from everyone present, officers, community leaders, legal experts, and civil rights advocates. He turned to face Collins and Brennan directly. Officers, you're not on trial here. You're about to become part of the solution. Your experience will help train thousands of other officers across the country. The tension in the officers' shoulders visibly relaxed. Sergeant Rodriguez nodded encouragingly at them from her seat. Your Honor, James addressed the judge. With your permission, I'd like to begin the training session, and I want to start by thanking Officers Collins and Brennan for their unwitting but invaluable contribution to police reform. Judge Martinez looked around the packed courtroom at the nervous officers, the surprised officials, the interested community leaders, and the attentive press. She understood now why James had arranged everything this way, why the revelation needed to happen here in a court of law. Commissioner Thompson Marshall, she said firmly, you have the court's full support. Proceed with your training program. As James began his presentation, Collins and Brennan exchanged glances. Their simple traffic stop had unexpectedly placed them at the center of what could become the biggest change in modern policing, and surprisingly, they found themselves ready to learn. 1 month after the courtroom revelation, Pine Grove Police Station looked very different. The walls now displayed new training posters, and the break room had been converted into a community meeting space. But the biggest changes weren't visible. They were in the attitudes of the officers themselves. Officer Collins sat at his desk, reviewing his body camera footage from the previous day's traffic stops. This had become a daily routine for all officers, watching their own interactions and noting areas for improvement. As he watched, he noticed something that would have escaped his attention just a month ago. His hand no longer automatically moved toward his weapon when approaching vehicles. Getting better, isn't it? Sergeant Rodriguez said, stopping by his desk. She had been promoted to head of community relations, a new position created by Commissioner Thompson Marshall. It's strange, Collins replied, pausing the video. I didn't realize how many unconscious habits I had until I started watching myself every day. Down the hallway, Officer Brennan was leading a training session for new recruits. The room was full of young officers watching the now famous traffic stop video of Commissioner Thompson Marshall. But this time, Brennan wasn't embarrassed by his actions in the video. He was using them to teach. Look at my body language here. He pointed to the screen. See how I'm standing? That's what we call a threat stance. I didn't even know I was doing it at the time. The recruits took notes eagerly. Pine Grove had become famous in police circles across the country. Officers from other cities were requesting transfers to learn the new training methods firsthand. In the station's new community meeting space, James Thompson Marshall sat with a group of local residents, listening to their experiences with law enforcement. He visited the station every 2 weeks, making sure the changes he started were taking root. "Last week, I got pulled over for a broken taillight," an elderly black man was saying, "but it was different this time. The officer was respectful, explained everything clearly, and even helped me find a good repair shop." James nodded, taking notes. "And the officer's name?" "Collins," the man replied. "He gave me his card and told me to call him directly if I had any problems with the repair shop." Later that afternoon, James met with Captain Hayes in his office. The captain had changed too. His desk now faced the door instead of the window, a small but significant change, showing his new focus on openness and accessibility. "The numbers are impressive," Hayes said, showing James the latest statistics. "Complaints are down 60%, community trust ratings are up. And surprisingly, our arrest rates for serious crimes have improved because people are more willing to work with us." "And the officers?" James asked. "How are they handling the changes?" "See for yourself." Hayes smiled, leading James to the break room. Through the window, they could see Collins and Brennan having lunch with 2 community leaders, something that would have been unthinkable just a month ago. The officers were laughing, relaxed, engaged in real conversation. "Commissioner," Sarah Martinez called, walking up with her ever-present tablet. "The governor's office called. They want to implement our training program statewide. And CN is requesting an interview about the Pine Grove model, as they're calling it." James watched the scene in the break room thoughtfully. "Tell them we'll do the interview, but not just with me. I want Collins and Brennan there too. This isn't just my story, it's theirs." In the parking lot that evening, Collins stopped Brennan before they left for the day. "Remember that night, partner? When we thought we were just making a routine traffic stop?" Brennan laughed. "How could I forget? We thought we were busting a suspicious character. Turns out we were part of something much bigger." "You know what's funny?" Collins said, looking back at the station. "That night, we thought we were the ones in control, testing him. But really, he was testing us. And because we failed that test honestly, we got a chance to make things right." As they walked to their cars, they passed a new sign that had been installed at the station's entrance. "Pine Grove Police Department, where community and law enforcement work as one." Below it, in smaller letters, was the date of that famous traffic stop, the night that changed everything. 6 months after the famous traffic stop, the Pine Grove Police Department hosted a special ceremony in the city park. Hundreds of people gathered under a bright blue sky, officers in dress uniforms, community members, media representatives, and police officials from across the country. Commissioner James Thompson Marshall stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. Beside him sat officers Collins and Brennan, now wearing new badges that identified them as community relations training officers. Their story had become a symbol of positive change in law enforcement. 6 months ago, James began, his voice carrying across the quiet park. "A routine traffic stop changed the future of policing in this country. Today, we're here to celebrate not just what we've accomplished, but what we've learned." He gestured to a large screen behind him, which showed statistics from the past 6 months. Traffic stop complaints down 75%, community trust ratings up 80%, and successful crime prevention up 45% due to improved community cooperation. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," James continued. "The real change is in the daily interactions between officers and citizens. Officer Collins, would you like to share your experience?" Collins stood up and walked to the podium, no longer the nervous officer from that fateful night. 6 months ago, I thought I knew everything about being a good police officer. I was wrong. True policing isn't about power or control, it's about understanding and respect." He pulled out his phone and showed the audience his newest app, a program developed by the department that helped officers review their daily interactions and identify potential bias in their behavior. Every morning, Collins explained, "I watch my body camera footage from the day before. But now, I'm not looking for threats or violations. I'm looking for opportunities to do better, to understand more, to serve better." Brennan took the podium next. "Last week, I pulled over a young black man in an expensive car. 6 months ago, I would have approached that situation with suspicion, but this time, I remembered my own learning experience. The driver turned out to be a local doctor rushing to an emergency. Instead of creating tension, we had a respectful conversation, and I gave him an escort to the hospital. The crowd applauded as Sarah Martinez presented the latest data from other cities that had adopted the Pine Grove model. 25 police departments across the country had implemented the new training program, with more joining every month. But the most important change, James said, returning to the podium, isn't in our procedures or statistics. It's in our hearts and minds. Officer Collins, Officer Brennan, would you join me? The two officers stood beside him as James unveiled two plaques. The first would hang in the police station's entrance, telling the story of the traffic stop that changed everything. The second was a new police oath, written jointly by officers and community members, emphasizing understanding, respect, and equal treatment for all. This oath, James explained, will be taken by every officer in departments that adopt our program. But more than that, it will be renewed every year, reminding us that learning and growing never stop. In the audience, Sergeant Rodriguez sat with several community leaders she now considered friends. Captain Hayes watched proudly as his station was recognized as a national model for police reform. Even Judge Martinez was present, smiling as she remembered the day her courtroom became a classroom for change. The ceremony ended with something unprecedented. Officers and community members took the new oath together, promising to work as partners in keeping their communities safe and fair for everyone. As people mingled afterward, Collins and Brennan found themselves talking with a group of officers from another city who had come to learn from their experience. The hardest part, Collins told them, is admitting your own biases. But once you do, you become a better officer and a better person. Brennan nodded. That traffic stop could have ended my career. Instead, it gave my career new meaning. From the edge of the crowd, James watched with satisfaction. His risky undercover operation had succeeded beyond his expectations. Pine Grove had become more than just a reformed police department. It was now a blueprint for change across the nation. As the sun set over the park, the new station motto gleamed on badges and banners. Protect, serve, understand. 3 simple words that had transformed a routine traffic stop into a revolution in modern policing.